The slide was still on the screen when the chairman interrupted me. He didn't clear his throat politely. He didn't wait for a natural transition point between slides. He just said it, clean and practiced, like he'd rehearsed the exact words. Clara, the board has decided to terminate your role as Chief Strategy Officer, effective immediately. My presentation clicker froze in my hand. The room went completely still. Around the polished conference table, 6 board members sat watching me with carefully neutral expressions. No one looked surprised. No one shifted uncomfortably in their seats. No one protested or asked for clarification. They all just sat there, waiting to see how I'd react. They'd planned this. Coordinated it. Timed it perfectly to happen mid-presentation, mid-sentence, in front of the executive team I'd personally recruited over the past 3 years. The humiliation was the point. Not just firing me, but doing it publicly, dramatically, in a way that would break me. I could see it in Chairman Howard's eyes. He expected tears, anger, a scene. Something he could point to later as proof I'd been too emotional, too unstable for leadership. The slide behind me showed Q4 projections I'd spent 2 months developing. Revenue growth strategies. Market expansion plans. Everything they'd need to execute the vision I'd built. My vision. My strategy. My work. And they'd just fired me in the middle of presenting it. The silence stretched for what felt like hours but was probably only 5 seconds. I looked around the table, meeting each board member's eyes in turn. Howard, the chairman, sitting at the head with his perfectly knotted tie and practiced expression of regret. Angela, the finance expert who'd praised my strategic thinking just last week. Marcus, who'd joined the board 6 months ago and immediately started undermining every decision I made. Olivia, who never spoke in meetings but always voted with Howard. Kenneth, the oldest member, who actually looked uncomfortable for the first time. And Dexter, the newest addition, who'd been asking pointed questions about my compensation package for the past 3 meetings. Not one of them defended me. Not one voice spoke up to question the timing or the decision. Not even a murmur of protest or surprise. This wasn't a sudden decision made in the heat of the moment. This was choreographed. They'd discussed this in private sessions I wasn't invited to. They'd debated the best approach, the optimal timing, the cleanest execution. They'd probably consulted lawyers about the severance terms and HR about the exit process. And they'd decided that the most effective moment to fire me was right here, right now, in front of everyone. The rehearsed nature of it was what hurt most. Not the firing itself. I'd sensed for weeks that something was wrong. But the calculated cruelty of doing it this way, at this moment, revealed exactly who they were. And that changed everything about how I'd respond. My thumb was still pressed against the presentation clicker, frozen mid-click. The slide hadn't advanced. Revenue projections from my strategic plan stared back at the room, numbers I'd personally verified, markets I'd personally researched, opportunities I'd personally identified. The cursor blinked on the screen, waiting for my next command. I could have dropped the clicker. Could have thrown it at Howard's smug face. Could have walked out immediately, leaving the presentation unfinished and my work unexplained. That's what they expected. What they'd planned for. The dramatic exit that would justify their decision to everyone watching. But I didn't react. Didn't move. Didn't let my expression change from the calm professionalism I'd maintained throughout the presentation. I just stood there, holding the clicker, looking at Howard with absolutely no emotion showing on my face. Because 3 weeks ago, I'd suspected this was coming. And I'd prepared. Not with anger or desperation, but with strategy. The same strategic thinking they were about to lose access to. I'd made calls. Arranged conversations. Set up contingencies they didn't know about. And most importantly, I'd invited 2 specific observers to this video call. Observers who weren't listed on the official attendance sheet. Observers the board thought were just silent IT support maintaining the connection. Observers who were actually listening very carefully to everything happening in this room. My lack of reaction confused them. I could see it in Howard's slight frown, in Angela's uncertain glance toward the chairman. They'd expected a fight. Instead, I gave them nothing. Just calm, controlled silence while I decided my next move. I set the clicker down on the table carefully. Deliberately. Then I looked at Howard and said, very calmly, I understand. I'd like to finish the presentation anyway, so you're fully informed before voting on the strategic plan." The request hung in the air. Howard's frown deepened. He clearly hadn't anticipated this. The script in his head probably involved me leaving immediately, maybe after some emotional outburst. Not requesting permission to continue presenting the very strategy they'd just fired me for developing. "I don't think that's necessary," he started to say. But Marcus interrupted. "Actually, we do need to complete the strategic review. The vote is scheduled for today, and we don't have another presentation prepared." He wasn't defending me. He was protecting the agenda. But the result was the same. He'd given me an opening. Howard looked around the table, clearly trying to gauge support for shutting me down. Angela nodded slightly. "We should hear the full presentation. We can separate the personnel decision from the strategic evaluation." Kenneth cleared his throat. "I agree. Let Clara finish." They were treating it like a procedural question, not recognizing what they were actually agreeing to. Howard hesitated, then nodded stiffly. "Fine. Please continue, but keep it brief." Brief. Right. Like I'd spent 2 months developing the strategy just to rush through it because they'd fired me. But I smiled slightly and picked up the clicker again. "Of course. Thank you." Something shifted in the room then. A subtle change in power dynamics that they didn't quite recognize yet. They'd given me permission to continue. And that was their first mistake. Because I wasn't going to present the strategy they expected anymore. I was going to show them exactly what they were losing. And I was going to do it for an audience they didn't know was watching. I advanced to the next slide and took a breath. "My name is Clara Bennett," I said, even though everyone in the room obviously knew who I was. "I've served as Chief Strategy Officer for 3 years. During that time, I've developed the frameworks you're about to vote on, recruited the team that will execute them, and identified the market opportunities that will define the next 5 years of growth." The formality was intentional. I was establishing ownership. Making it clear, on record, with observers listening, that this wasn't the board's strategy or Howard's vision. This was mine. Every board member shifted slightly. They'd expected me to just walk through the slides mechanically. Instead, I was framing the narrative. Taking control of the story before they could write me out of it. "The strategy you're reviewing today represents 18 months of research, development, and market analysis," I continued. "It's built on relationships I've personally cultivated, data I've personally verified, and projections I'm personally confident in." I clicked to the next slide. Market segmentation analysis. These aren't theoretical opportunities. These are concrete markets with identified entry points, calculated risk profiles, and realistic timelines. Angela was taking notes now. Kenneth was leaning forward. Even Marcus looked interested, though he was clearly trying to hide it. They'd been planning to vote on this strategy after firing me. Now they were being forced to confront exactly who had created what they were about to claim as the board's decision. I wasn't defending myself. Wasn't arguing against the termination. I was simply making absolutely clear what they were losing and who deserved credit for what came next. The observers on the call were hearing all of it. And that was the entire point. I walked through the framework systematically, explaining each component I'd built from scratch. The customer segmentation model that had taken 4 months to develop. The competitive analysis based on relationships with industry insiders I'd cultivated over years. The pricing strategy built on market research I'd personally commissioned and analyzed. "This framework isn't theoretical," I explained, clicking through supporting data. "Every assumption has been tested. Every projection has been validated against real market conditions. Every timeline accounts for realistic implementation challenges." I could see them processing the implications. They'd planned to take this strategy, vote it through, and execute it without me. But I was making it very clear that the strategy wasn't a document they could simply hand off to my replacement. It was embedded in relationships, insights, and knowledge that existed in my head. Not in slide decks. Not in spreadsheets. In me. Howard was starting to look uncomfortable. "Good. The revenue projections on the next slide assume specific execution capabilities," I continued. "Relationships with key partners that I've personally developed. Market insights that came from conversations I've personally had. Timing advantages that depend on credibility I've personally built. Each personally was deliberate. A reminder that they weren't just firing an executive. They were losing the architect of their entire growth strategy. And they were starting to realize it. But they'd already committed to the termination. Already made the decision public. Already triggered whatever succession plan they'd developed behind my back. They couldn't reverse course now without looking incompetent. Which meant I could keep going. Keep demonstrating their mistake. Keep showing the observers exactly what kind of leader was being pushed out. This was no longer about keeping my job. This was about making sure everyone understood what was actually happening here. Kenneth wouldn't meet my eyes. I noticed it during a pause between slides. He was studying his notes, his coffee cup, anything except looking directly at me. That meant something. Kenneth owed me. 18 months ago, his private equity firm had been struggling with a portfolio company in crisis. The CEO had quit unexpectedly, investors were panicking, and the whole investment was circling the drain. I'd stepped in as an advisor, off the books, on my own time, and helped stabilize the situation. Developed an interim strategy, recruited a replacement CEO, bought them enough time to execute a successful exit. Kenneth's firm had made $30 million on a deal that should have been a total loss. And he'd never properly acknowledged it. Never thanked me publicly. Never returned the favor. Now he sat there, avoiding my gaze, while I was being fired in front of everyone. The guilt was written all over his face. But guilt wasn't enough to make him speak up against Howard. Wasn't enough to risk his board position or his relationship with the chairman. He'd choose self-preservation over integrity, just like he always did. I made a mental note of it. Not for revenge, I didn't need revenge. For information. For understanding exactly who could be counted on and who would fold under pressure. Kenneth had just showed me who he really was. And when this was over, I'd remember. The observers on the call would remember too. Because I was building a record here. Not just of my competence, but of everyone else's character. And that record would matter very soon. I clicked to the financial projections slide. Numbers I'd spent weeks validating, models I'd personally built, assumptions I'd tested against every reasonable scenario. These projections assume a 3-year implementation timeline, I explained. A year 1 focuses on market entry and brand establishment. Year 2 on scaling and optimization. Year 3 on expansion and diversification. Howard was nodding along like he understood the work behind these numbers. Like he'd contributed anything beyond rubber stamping my budget requests. The revenue curve accelerates in Q3 of year 2, I continued, based on anticipated market maturation and competitive positioning. This timing has been validated against comparable market entries and adjusted for our specific advantages. Angela raised her hand slightly. What are those specific advantages? It was the first question anyone had asked since they'd fired me. I met her eyes directly. Relationships with key distribution partners that I've personally developed over 3 years. Credibility with industry influencers who trust my judgment specifically. And market timing based on insights from conversations that happened because of my network, not the company's brand. The implication was clear. These advantages disappeared the moment I walked out the door. They hadn't questioned these projections when they'd planned to keep me. Now they were being forced to consider whether the numbers still held without the person who generated them. Marcus tried to recover. Surely the company's resources and brand carry more weight than any individual's relationships. I smiled slightly. The projections were built assuming my continued involvement. If you'd like me to model alternative scenarios based on different leadership capabilities, I can do that. But it would require making significant downward adjustments. Silence. I'd just told them their strategy would fail without me. Politely. Professionally. With data to back it up. And there was nothing they could say to refute it without admitting they'd made a catastrophic mistake. 2 lines on the video call screen showed as muted participants. Not camera off, just muted. No names displayed, just generic guest 1 and guest 2 identifiers. The board hadn't questioned them. Probably assumed they were IT support or administrative staff maintaining the connection. Standard video call background noise. But I knew exactly who they were. And they were listening to everything. 3 weeks ago, when I'd started suspecting the board was planning to remove me, I'd reached out to 2 people. Not friends. Not former colleagues. Strategic contacts who'd been trying to recruit me for months. Venture capitalists who'd been building a portfolio company in an adjacent market and needed someone with my exact expertise. I'd told them I might be available soon. That there might be an opportunity to observe my work under pressure. That if they wanted to see how I handled adversity, they should dial into this specific board meeting as silent observers. They'd agreed immediately. Set it up through a back channel that bypassed the board's official invitation system. And now they were listening to me get fired and watching how I responded. Watching me stay calm. Watching me finish the presentation despite the humiliation. Watching me demonstrate competence and grace under the worst possible circumstances. This wasn't just a board meeting anymore. This was a live audition. And the board had no idea they were helping me showcase exactly why I was worth hiring. I clicked to the next slide, aware that every word I said was being evaluated by people who actually valued what I brought to the table. People who were looking for competence, not compliance. For results, not politics. The board thought they were ending my career. They were actually launching it. I adjusted the deck mid-presentation, skipping 2 slides that were no longer relevant and pulling up a backup section I'd prepared. I didn't ask permission. Didn't announce what I was doing. Just changed the flow because the presentation needed it. It was a small thing. A detail most people wouldn't even notice. But it demonstrated something important. I was still in command of this room. They'd fired me, but they hadn't taken control. Howard noticed. His eyes narrowed slightly as I deviated from the printed agenda he was holding. But he didn't interrupt. Couldn't interrupt without looking petty. I'd asked permission to finish the presentation, and he'd granted it. Now he had to let me actually finish. I'm going to adjust the order slightly, I said calmly, to address some questions that came up during the Finance Committee review last week. That was a lie. There had been no questions. But it sounded legitimate enough that no one challenged it. And it let me restructure the presentation to emphasize exactly what I wanted the observers to hear. I pulled up a slide showing alternative implementation approaches. 3 different execution paths, each with different resource requirements and risk profiles. The original recommendation assumes stable leadership and institutional knowledge, I explained. But given potential changes in personnel, I let that hang in the air for just a moment. It may be worth considering alternative approaches that account for transition costs and knowledge transfer challenges. I was literally showing them how the strategy would need to change without me. Documenting the problems they'd created by firing me. And they couldn't stop me without admitting those problems existed. The reclaimed command was subtle but absolute. I wasn't their employee anymore. I was an expert presenting analysis they desperately needed. And that shifted everything. Howard tried to interrupt again. I think we can move through this section more quickly, I kept talking. Not louder. Not confrontationally. Just continued my explanation as if he hadn't spoken. The risk mitigation strategies on this slide are particularly critical if implementation leadership changes, I said, maintaining the same calm, professional tone. Historical data shows that strategic transitions typically experience a 30 to 40% decline in execution quality when key personnel turn over. I wasn't being subtle anymore. I was directly telling them their strategy would fail without me. And I was doing it with data, with research, with evidence they couldn't dismiss. Howard's face reddened slightly. Clara, I don't think the competitive analysis on the next slide supports this concern, I continued smoothly. Our primary competitors have stable leadership teams with an average tenure of 7 years. Institutional knowledge and relationship continuity give them significant advantages in execution speed and market credibility. I clicked to the next slide without pausing. Marcus was watching Howard, waiting to see if the chairman would shut me down forcefully. But Howard couldn't. Not without looking weak, not without admitting he'd lost control of the meeting. And definitely not without revealing that he hadn't actually thought through the consequences of firing me mid-presentation. Angela was taking detailed notes now. Kenneth was staring at his laptop screen. Olivia looked confused. The power dynamics had shifted completely. I wasn't the fired employee asking for mercy. I was the expert they needed, explaining why their decision had been catastrophic. And they were starting to understand it. Too late to reverse course. Too publicly committed to the termination. But understanding it nonetheless. While two observers on the call watched and took notes for a very different kind of conversation we'd be having very soon. Howard made a claim about authorship that I couldn't let slide. The strategic framework we're voting on represents the board's collaborative vision, he said, trying to regain control of the narrative. Multiple stakeholders contributed to its development. I stopped advancing slides, looked directly at him, and corrected him. Calmly, clearly, on the record. That's not accurate, I said. The strategic framework was developed by me over 18 months. The board reviewed and approved elements, but the research, analysis, and synthesis were done by my team under my direct leadership. The room went very still. Angela stopped taking notes. Marcus sat back in his chair. Kenneth finally looked at me. I have documentation supporting this if anyone would like to review it, I continued. Research proposals I personally authored. Analysis I personally conducted. Presentation materials I personally developed. The board provided valuable input and approval, but characterizing this as a collaborative development process misrepresents the actual work. I wasn't being aggressive. Wasn't raising my voice. Just stating facts with the kind of calm certainty that made them impossible to dispute. Howard's face went from red to pale. He'd tried to claim credit for my work in front of everyone, and I'd called him out directly. Professionally. With offers of documentation to back it up. I'm not disputing the board's authority to make strategic decisions, I clarified. I'm clarifying who did the actual work of developing the options you're deciding between. That distinction matters for implementation planning and knowledge transfer. Truth had landed clean and sharp. They could fire me. They could take my strategy and vote it through. But they couldn't erase my authorship or pretend this framework came from anywhere except my mind and my effort. The observers had heard every word. And that mattered more than anything happening in this room. The questions started coming, but not from the board members I expected. Can you elaborate on the risk mitigation strategies in Scenario 2? It was one of the muted observers. The voice came through clearly, professionally. A woman's voice I recognized, Naomi Chin from Apex Ventures. The board members looked confused. Howard frowned at the screen. Who's speaking? Guest participant, I said smoothly. IT flagged some technical questions during the finance review. I invited them to listen in for the strategic discussion. It was a complete lie. But it sounded plausible enough that Howard couldn't challenge it without derailing the meeting further. And he'd already lost too much control to risk another confrontation. I answered Naomi's question directly, providing the detailed analysis she'd requested. Then the second observer spoke. How does the timeline account for market seasonality? That was Marcus Joe from Catalyst Partners. Both of them. Both venture capitalists I'd been in conversation with for weeks. Both asking questions that let me demonstrate my expertise while the board sat there, suddenly irrelevant to the conversation. I walked through seasonality considerations, market timing, competitive positioning. Answering their questions with the kind of detailed knowledge that came from years of experience and months of research. The board was watching this happen, watching me conduct what was essentially a pitch meeting with unknown observers while they sat helpless to stop it. Because they'd agreed to let me finish the presentation. They'd given me the floor. And now I was using it to show other potential employers exactly what I could do. Howard tried to regain control. I think we should limit questions to board members. These are clarifying questions about implementation details, I said. Addressing them now will help with the vote. I didn't wait for permission. Just continued answering the observers' questions while the board watched their meeting get hijacked by an audience they didn't know existed. I answered every question without notes. Without hesitation. Without any defensive posturing about being fired or undermined. Just clear, confident expertise delivered with the kind of authority that comes from actually knowing your subject matter deeply. The implementation timeline assumes quarterly milestone reviews, I explained in response to another question. Each review includes quantitative performance metrics and qualitative market feedback. This allows for course correction without compromising the overall strategic direction. Naomi asked about competitive responses. I walked through likely scenarios based on competitor behavior patterns I'd documented over 3 years. Marcus asked about capital efficiency. I provided detailed projections showing how different funding approaches would impact ROI at each stage. Every answer demonstrated depth. Not just surface-level strategy speak, but actual understanding of how markets work, how companies execute, how real businesses succeed or fail. The board members were silent now. Just listening. Probably realizing that they'd severely underestimated what they were losing. Angela was still taking notes, but her expression had changed. She looked worried. Kenneth was frowning at his laptop like he was running calculations. Even Marcus seemed subdued. They were watching me field complex questions with ease while maintaining complete composure despite having been fired 20 minutes ago. That kind of grace under pressure was exactly what boards claimed to value in leadership. Competence wasn't about titles. It was about this, the ability to deliver value regardless of circumstances, to maintain professionalism under attack, to focus on substance instead of politics. And I was demonstrating it in real time while they sat there, unable to do anything except watch the opportunity they'd just thrown away conduct a masterclass in strategic thinking for someone else's benefit. I presented an alternative execution approach that hadn't been in the original deck. Something I'd developed over the past 2 weeks as a contingency plan. Leaner. Faster. Less dependent on the existing organizational structure. This alternative approach assumes a smaller, more focused team, I explained. Rather than trying to execute across the full organization, it concentrates resources on the highest value opportunities and scales incrementally based on proven success. I showed the financial model. Lower upfront costs. Faster time to revenue. Higher risk, but also higher potential returns. The original plan was designed for this organization's specific capabilities and constraints, I continued. But if implementation circumstances change significantly, this alternative might be more appropriate. I wasn't being subtle. This was the strategy I'd execute if I left and started fresh somewhere else. More agile. Less bureaucratic. Built for speed instead of consensus. The board hadn't been offered this option. They'd only seen the version designed for their organization, with all its political constraints and structural limitations. Now I was showing them what was possible without those constraints. And I was showing the observers exactly what they could build if they backed me. Marcus caught on first. His eyes widened slightly. This alternative wasn't in the materials we reviewed. No, I agreed. I developed it recently as a response to changing market conditions. It represents a different philosophy about organizational design and execution speed. Translation: this is what I'd build if I wasn't stuck working with you. Angela looked between the two approaches, clearly doing mental math about implementation costs and timeline differences. The alternative was objectively better. More efficient. More focused. More likely to succeed. They'd never get to execute it because it required capabilities they didn't have. But someone else could. Someone willing to back me without the political baggage and organizational inertia that plagued this company. I'd just pitched my next venture while pretending to present their strategic options. And they were just now realizing it. Dexter was the one who finally understood what was happening. I saw the realization hit him mid-slide. His expression changed from bored indifference to sharp attention. He sat forward, eyes moving between me and the video call screen, clearly trying to work out who the observers were and why I'd invited them. Who exactly is on this call? He asked, interrupting me mid-sentence. I want to know who's listening to confidential board discussions. It was a fair question. One they should have asked 30 minutes ago. I met his gaze calmly. The attendee list was distributed with the meeting invitation. If you have concerns about confidentiality, you should raise them with the meeting chair. That was technically true. The attendee list had been distributed. It just hadn't included the back-channel observers because they'd joined through a separate system. But my answer sounded legitimate enough to put the burden back on Howard. Dexter looked at Howard. Did you approve additional participants? Howard looked flustered. The standard IT support is on the call for technical management. These questions aren't coming from IT support, Dexter said flatly. I could see him putting it together. The sophisticated questions. My detailed answers. The fact that I'd stayed completely calm through being fired and was now conducting what looked like a recruitment presentation. Too late, though. The presentation was nearly done. The damage was complete. They'd allowed me to demonstrate my competence, showcase my work, and pitch my capabilities to potential backers while they sat there debating attendance policies. "We're nearly finished," I said. "Unless the board would prefer to end the presentation now." It was a challenge. End it and prove they were afraid of what else I might reveal. Or let me continue and watch me finish on my terms. Howard hesitated, clearly torn. The room held its breath. Finally, he nodded stiffly. "Continue. But briefly." I smiled. Briefly. Sure. I'd already said everything I needed to say. The observers had heard it all. The board's mistake was complete. I finished with the strongest close I'd ever delivered. Not because I was trying to save my job, that was gone. But because I was demonstrating exactly what these board members had just thrown away. The strategic framework represents significant opportunity, I concluded. But opportunity requires execution capability. The analysis is sound. The market timing is right. The competitive positioning is strong. What determines success or failure isn't the strategy itself, it's the quality and commitment of the team implementing it. I looked around the table, making eye contact with each board member. This framework was built on relationships, insights, and expertise that took years to develop. It assumes continuity, institutional knowledge, and market credibility that can't be easily transferred or replicated. Whoever executes this strategy will need to account for those factors. It was the most professional way possible to say, "You're going to fail without me." And every person in that room understood it. I clicked to the final slide. Just the company logo and a single line, Strategic Framework Presentation, Clara Bennett, Chief Strategy Officer. The title was outdated as of 20 minutes ago. But the authorship was permanent. "That concludes the presentation," I said calmly. "I'm happy to answer any additional questions the board has before voting." Silence. No one had questions. No one wanted to prolong this anymore. The room felt heavy with the weight of what they'd done and what they'd just witnessed. No applause. No thank you. Just quiet. But it was the kind of silence that meant something. Respect, maybe. Or recognition. Or just the uncomfortable awareness that they'd made a serious mistake and there was no way to undo it. The observers on the call had heard everything. And that was all I needed. Howard cleared his throat and formally ended the meeting with abrupt efficiency. "Thank you for the presentation, Clara. The board will take it under advisement. We'll be in touch with next steps regarding your transition." Transition. Such a clean corporate word for being forced out. He was already moving on. Already trying to regain control of the narrative. "The board will now move into executive session to discuss the strategic vote and related matters," he continued, looking at the camera. "All non-board participants should disconnect at this time." I nodded once. Closed my laptop. Gathered my materials with the same calm professionalism I'd maintained throughout. Not rushing. Not dragging my feet. Just completing the task I'd been given with dignity. As I reached for my bag, Kenneth finally spoke. "Clara, I want to say," he stopped. Couldn't find the words. Or couldn't say them in front of Howard. I looked at him steadily. "It's fine, Kenneth. I understand." I did understand. I understood exactly what kind of person he was. What kind of person they all were. Marcus was already pulling up spreadsheets. Angela wouldn't meet my eyes. Olivia looked relieved this was ending. Dexter was still staring at the video call screen, trying to work out what had just happened. Only Howard maintained eye contact as I walked toward the door. "We'll send termination details through HR," he said. "Please coordinate with them regarding company property and access credentials." "Of course," I replied. Professional. Cooperative. Giving them no ammunition for whatever story they'd tell about this later. I reached the door. Paused. Turned back. "For what it's worth," I said quietly, "I hope the strategy succeeds. A lot of good people worked hard on it." Then I left. Walked out of the conference room with my head up and my materials under my arm. Behind me, I heard the board beginning their executive session. discussing my strategy, planning to vote it through, preparing to execute work I'd created while trying to erase me from the story. Their control was slipping. They just didn't know it yet. I was halfway down the hallway when my phone buzzed. A message on the video call app from one of the muted observers. A guest one requests a private conversation. Please call when you're available. I didn't respond immediately. Just kept walking through the office I'd worked in for 3 years. Past the cubicles of people who didn't know yet that I'd been fired. Past conference rooms where I'd built strategies and coached teams. Past the corner office that used to be mine and would soon belong to whoever they'd already selected to replace me. My desk was already cleared. I'd done that yesterday, sensing this was coming. Personal items packed. Files backed up. Nothing left that I'd need to retrieve later. I'd been preparing for this moment for weeks. Not hoping for it, but ready for it. Outside the building, I finally pulled out my phone and opened the message properly. Naomi Chen from Apex Ventures wanted to talk. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Now. I found a quiet coffee shop 2 blocks away. Ordered something I didn't intend to drink. Settled into a corner booth. And called her back. She answered immediately. That was impressive, she said without preamble. Most people would have fallen apart being fired like that. You turned it into a showcase. I had a feeling you might be watching, I replied. I wanted you to see how I handle pressure. We saw. Marcus and I have been discussing it for the past 15 minutes. We'd like to meet with you today if possible. We have a term sheet we think you'll be interested in. Today. They weren't wasting time. Neither was I can meet in 2 hours, I said. Perfect. I'll text you the address. She hung up. Just like that, the real meeting was starting. The board thought they'd ended my career. They'd actually just launched the next phase of it. The term sheet conversation moved faster than I'd expected. Naomi and Marcus met me in a private conference room at Apex Ventures' downtown office. Professional. Direct. No small talk or false sympathy about what had happened. We've been watching your work for 6 months, Naomi explained. We've been building a portfolio company in the smart logistics space and needed someone with your strategic capabilities. We approached you twice about joining, but you weren't ready to leave. I wasn't, I agreed. I had work to finish. And now? Now I'm available. And I understand exactly what kind of board I don't want to work with again. Marcus smiled. We did due diligence on you 3 weeks ago. Talked to former colleagues, reviewed your work product, analyzed your strategic frameworks. Everything checked out. But we needed to see one more thing. What was that? How you handle adversity. How you respond when things go wrong. Whether you maintain composure or fall apart under pressure. Naomi leaned forward. What we saw today was someone who got fired mid-presentation and turned it into a masterclass in strategic thinking. That told us everything we needed to know about your character and capabilities. They'd been evaluating me. Not just my skills, but my resilience. The due diligence wasn't spontaneous, I said slowly, understanding. You've been planning this for weeks. We started when you first mentioned you might be available soon, Marcus confirmed. We expedited when you invited us to observe the board meeting. This wasn't opportunistic. This was planned. They'd prepared. Just like I had. 2 strategic players recognizing mutual advantage and moving quickly to capitalize on it. Show me the term sheet, I said. I pulled the folded term sheet from my coat pocket and placed it on the table between us. They looked surprised. You already have it? Naomi asked. I printed it this morning, I said. You emailed it to me 3 days ago. I've been reviewing the terms since then. Marcus laughed. You knew this was coming. I suspected. And I don't like being unprepared. The term sheet was generous. Chief Strategy Officer role at their portfolio company. Significant equity stake. Board seat. Full autonomy over strategic direction. And most importantly, the resources to actually execute without political interference. We've made some revisions since the original version you received, Naomi said, sliding a new document across the table. Based on what we saw today, we're increasing the equity offer and adding performance accelerators. I reviewed the new terms carefully. They'd effectively doubled the equity stake and added provisions that would increase it further if I hit specific performance milestones. This wasn't just a job offer. This was a partnership. The portfolio company launches in 6 weeks, Marcus explained. We need someone who can hit the ground running, build a team, and execute strategy immediately. No ramp-up time. No learning curve. Just immediate high-level strategic execution. That's aggressive, I noted. That's necessary, Naomi replied. The market window is now. We can't wait 6 months for traditional hiring processes. We need someone who's already proven they can do this work at this level. They needed me. Not someone like me. Me specifically. With my skills, my relationships, my track record. I have one condition, I said. What's that? I want to bring my team with me. The key people I recruited and developed. They deserve better than what they're about to experience at the old company. Marcus and Naomi exchanged glances. Names and roles. I pulled out my phone and showed them the list I'd prepared. 5 people. All critical. All excellent. Naomi nodded. We can make that work. But we'll need to move fast before they get locked into retention packages. They won't, I said. I've already talked to them. They're ready. Everything was in motion. Everything was ready. I'd been preparing this exit for weeks, and now it was happening exactly as I'd planned. Just faster. I didn't say goodbye to the board. Didn't send a farewell email to Howard or thank the members for the opportunity to serve. Just signed the term sheet, coordinated with Naomi and Marcus about start date and logistics, and walked out of Apex Ventures' office with a new future secured. By the time I got home, my phone was already buzzing with messages from my team. The board had announced the termination internally. Made it sound mutual. Pursuing other opportunities. Strategic differences. The usual corporate euphemisms. But my team knew better. They'd been in the presentation. They'd watched me get fired mid-sentence. And now they were watching the board try to spin it as a planned transition. I sent a group message to the 5 people I wanted to bring with me. New opportunity. Better structure. Launching in 6 weeks. Are you interested? All 5 responded within an hour. All 5 said yes. The board had thought firing me would be simple. Remove one person. Replace with someone more compliant. Move forward with my strategy under their control. They hadn't considered that I'd built a team loyal to me personally. That I'd recruited people who valued competence and integrity over political safety. That removing me would trigger an immediate exodus of the talent they'd need to execute the strategy I'd developed. By tomorrow morning, they'd be dealing with 5 resignation letters. By next week, they'd be scrambling to understand why their strategic execution was falling apart. I didn't feel triumphant about it. Just satisfied that competence and loyalty were being rewarded while politics and betrayal were facing natural consequences. No goodbye to the board. No closure for them. Just the sudden realization that they'd lost more than they'd understood when they'd fired me. And that realization was just beginning. The emails flooded in that night. Polite messages from board members who'd sat silent during the termination. Kenneth sent a long note about respecting my contributions and hoping we could stay in touch professionally. Angela wrote about understanding if I felt hurt but hoping I'd consider consulting on the strategic transition. Even Marcus reached out, claiming he'd always valued my work despite our disagreements. Too polite. Too late. They'd had their chance to speak up during the meeting. They'd chosen silence. Now they wanted to preserve relationships they'd just destroyed. I responded to none of them. Deleted each message after reading it without sending any reply. They didn't deserve my emotional labor or professional courtesy anymore. Dexter's message was different. More honest. I figured out what happened today. Smart play. I would have done the same thing. No hard feelings. At least he was direct about it. Still didn't respond. He'd been part of the termination decision. His admiration for my strategy didn't change that. Howard didn't email at all. Probably still convinced he'd handled everything correctly. Still believing the narrative that they'd made a difficult but necessary leadership decision. Still unaware that he'd just triggered the collapse of everything he'd planned. By morning, the news would spread. 5 key people resigning simultaneously. Strategic execution in chaos. Board scrambling to explain what went wrong. And me, already moved on to something better with the exact team I'd wanted to build with. They'd wanted access to my work, my relationships, my strategic thinking. But they'd wanted it without me. Without my authority, my autonomy, my actual participation in the success. Now they'd learn what my work was actually worth when the person who'd created it wasn't there to maintain it. The emails kept coming. I kept deleting them. And I started planning my first week at the new company. The news broke publicly 3 days later. Not because I leaked it. Because the board's instability was too obvious to hide. Strategic leadership shakeup at, company name, read the headline in the industry journal. Chief Strategy Officer terminated mid-presentation, key team members resign in protest. The article detailed the board meeting. Someone had talked, probably someone who'd been on the video call and disapproved of how the termination was handled. It described the timing, the public humiliation, my calm response. It mentioned the 5 immediate resignations. And it questioned the board's judgment in removing the architect of their strategic plan right before voting to implement it. The market reacted predictably. Stock price dropped 4% on the news. Analysts downgraded their outlook citing a leadership uncertainty and execution risk. Industry observers began questioning whether the company could execute its aggressive growth plans without the team that had developed them. Howard issued a statement defending the decision. Strategic differences. Mutual agreement to part ways. Complete confidence in our execution capabilities. Nobody believed him. The follow-up coverage was brutal. How to destroy your strategy in one board meeting. The cost of political boardrooms. Why firing your best people mid-presentation is never a good idea. My name appeared in every article. Not as a victim. As a cautionary tale about what companies lose when boards prioritize politics over competence. Several pieces mentioned I'd already signed with a new venture. That the same team they'd just lost was joining me there. That we'd be competing directly with their strategic plans using leaner approaches and better execution. The board's instability was showing. And it was showing exactly when I needed it to. Not because I wanted revenge. But because I wanted the record clear about what had actually happened and who was responsible for what came next. Let the market judge. Let the industry watch. Let everyone see what happens when boards make decisions based on power instead of performance. I signed the final paperwork with Apex Ventures on a Tuesday morning. Chief Strategy Officer. 20% equity. Board seat. Full team hired. Launch scheduled for 4 weeks. The contract was everything I'd hoped for when I'd first suspected I might need to leave the old company. Autonomy. Resources. Partners who valued strategy over politics. A team that chose to follow me rather than stay for safety. And most importantly, ownership of what I built. Not just employment. Partnership. The people who'd watched me get fired mid-presentation were the same people now backing me to build something better. They'd seen me under pressure and decided I was worth betting on. That mattered more than any board position or impressive title. That first week, I focused on execution rather than looking backward. Built the strategic framework. Established team rhythms. Developed relationships with key partners. Proved that what I'd promised in that presentation wasn't just theory. 3 months later, we closed our first major client. 6 months later, we hit profitability ahead of schedule. 9 months later, we were outperforming the strategic projections I'd developed for the old company. Everything I'd said in that board meeting was proving true. The strategy was sound. The market timing was right. The execution capability was there. The only difference was who controlled it. The board had thought firing me would be simple. Remove the person. Keep the strategy. Move forward under their control. They'd learned differently. They'd fired my title. I'd walked out owning my future. And that made all the difference. Years later, people still ask me about that presentation. About how I stayed calm. How I finished despite being humiliated. How I turned termination into opportunity. The answer is simple: I prepared. I documented. I built relationships. And when the moment came, I executed. Not with drama or revenge. Just with competence, clarity, and the confidence that comes from knowing your actual worth. They tried to end something. I turned it into a beginning. And that's the only ending that matters.